around Southport, you could be thinking, what a sleepy little town. People do think that, and they're partly right. But mostly, of course, they're wrong. So if you're a newcomer or a visitor, we're going to let you in on some things. Things like lighthouses and Little Coney, and wrecks and rescues, and pogie boats and U-boats, and a really nasty lady named Hazel, and a place called Monkey Wrench Corner. Now, of course, if you lived here all your life, well, just sit back and remember. First and foremost, Southport is a fishing village and the water gateway to the rest of the state. That wonderful seafood you find at our restaurants has been drawing visitors for a long time. And for an even longer time, it's provided a decent living for those who have lived here in Southport, even when it was called Smithville, but we'll get to that shortly. But fishing hasn't always been just for food. It was the menhaden, a fish that's not good to eat, that was a major part of building this town, along with shrimp and the river pilots. Fishing for menhaden, or pogies, was the #1 industry until the middle of the 20th century. The menhaden produced oil that went into paint, linoleum, and a lot of other things. And what was left when the oil was squeezed out was used for fertilizer and for feed for livestock. The town counted on the pogies. Southport historian and author Susie Carson remembers.
They'd be coming in, they'd do the chanties, yes, I do. And I knew I would see so many of the men going by our house, they would walk. Most of them were black people, and they would walk from their residences over here in the western part of town down to the waterfront, and they were usually singing, and they seemed to be, I'm sure they weren't always happy, but they would sing, and they were very faithful to their job. They did a wonderful job in keeping that industry going.
Southport native Margaret Harper remembers the signal horns that told those on shore how good a day it had been.
They would blow, and local people knew exactly how many 100,000 fish each, when they would blow. It would indicate, well, what they were really blowing was not to tell people in Southport how many they caught, but to notify the fish factories how many they were bringing in.
Eugene Gore, who later would go on to be the skipper of the shrimp boats Mary L. and Claudia J., was webbing in nets on the purse boats back then, and explains what constituted a good day.
Maybe 100,000 was a fairly fair day. Then maybe 200,000, maybe that was a good day. But a load was a real good day. When you fill the hole up, and then run them on to fill the decks up. And the boat, them wooden boats, and then they go down in the water sometime like that.
Did I call it a purse boat? That's right. It was called that because the net had a line at the bottom, like the drawstring on a lady's purse. Pull that, and the fish were caught. It was backbreaking work on those pogie boats, but Tom Frink says working the boats was not all bad.
It was hard work and a lot of fun. We didn't make much money. We was paid share according to what we caught. That's how we got paid. Plus, there might be some times that the wind might blow for a whole week and you couldn't get out. And it was a tough life, but that was all that was in Southport at that time. It was, you either fished or swam or went out of Southport and worked on the farms.
Working the menhaden boats led to a unique form of music which set the pace for hoisting the catch. In later years, some of those who had worked the boats formed a singing group that became a local favorite.
That's why I'm going back to where
Eugene Gore still remembers pulling those nets, and at age 84 can still sing those songs.
Get back, boys. Get back. We're back. We're back. We're back. Yeah, they break up. Yeah, they break up. We're back. We're back. We're back. And the fish be just jumping, flipping, flipping. Oh, you ought to been to heaven 10,000 years, drinking of the wine. Get back now. Right on back. Right on back. Right on back. Oh, you about to get them. Yeah, you about to get them. Get them. Get them. Two white horses side by side. Here we go back now. Here, one more time. One more time.
Pogie boats worked this whole area, out beyond the bar at what they called the Mud Hole, off Long Beach, along East Beach, and up toward Carolina and Wrightsville beaches, then south to Little River and Georgetown. But they'd also go way north to Virginia and New Jersey, anywhere where there were fish, before the season and the pay ran out.
And then we'd go to Florida, south, and Louisiana, and Texas. And that was normally about a 7-month season. And you'd come back the last of September. Then you would sign up until next May when you went back again, because it wouldn't be anything else to do. So we would go to the states that paid unemployment compensation, so we would just draw unemployment.
To put it delicately, Menhaden had an aroma about them. When the wind was right, you could smell Southport long before you got here. But for those who lived and worked here in those days, that was the smell of money. But so was the aroma of Southport's other catch of the day. Shrimping was big business too, and still is. Captain Toby Thompson recalls when it was really big.
There would be 75, maybe 100 shrimp boats working out of here in the fall of the year. And the shrimp boats then were catching like 75 to 100, 125 bushel of shrimp a day. And I remember that in the morning when these boats went out, they didn't know what they were going to get paid until they came back in, because the dealers had to find out what they were bringing on the New York market.
In the shrimp houses, women worked heading shrimp and getting paid a nickel a bucket. When the catches were big, they'd work all night, heading shrimp sometimes until their fingers started to bleed and they had to wear gloves. But later, Tom Frink remembers, the pay got better.
I don't know exactly what date it was, but after Hazel, it was about 3 of the guys put the shrimp houses back. A lot of them didn't rebuild back. But then they started paying by the pound, and I think it was like 30 cents a pound. You could really kind of make some money then by, paying by the pound rather than by the bucket.
But on a Friday in 1954, everything about the Southport waterfront and much about the fishing industry changed forever. Her name was Hazel, and she was no lady. Just ask Susie Carson.
Hazel just about destroyed the waterfront, but it was remarkable that it didn't do as much damage up in town as it did on the waterfront.
Longtime Southporter Leela Piggott, who with her husband Dallas was in the commercial seafood business, says that despite some reports of a major storm on the radio, people always believed the big ones hit Florida.
We heard this on the radio, that there was a hurricane headed this way. Well, we didn't get too upset about it until it began the weather changed completely. And by that night, we knew we were in trouble.
Like every seaport, Southport had relied for decades on forecasts by telegraph. People would watch for Mrs. Jessie Taylor to hoist the storm flag warnings on the tower at the garrison. Mrs. Taylor, like her father before her, was the volunteer weather observer from 1922 until her death. Far too often she had to hoist the red and black squares of a hurricane warning. But despite the signal flags and radio reports, no one in Southport in those pre-Weather Channel days could really conceive of what was about to hit them. But hit, it did.
June now, I got in the car, I just got my driver's license, and drove down to Atlantic Street on the water down there. And one thing is I'll never forget, I guess. As soon as I got down there, there was a 2-story house going down the river. Where it come from, I don't know.
If Hazel changed the face of Southport's waterfront, it washed the face of Oak Island clean. There's some debate on exact numbers, but it's generally agreed that out of about 300 cottages on Long Beach, either 3 or 5 of them were left standing when Hazel departed. And as is usually the case with hurricanes, it was the water, not wind, that was the deadliest. Captain Toby Thompson remembers the storm surge as at least 9 feet. Some say it was higher.
The surge from the ocean pushed the front row of houses into the second row and knocked them down. They were like dominoes. And that's what caused so much damage over there.
By any measure, Hazel was a disaster, and it called for heroic efforts. And they weren't long in coming. The military ocean terminal Sunny Point, mostly known now as just Sunny Point, was still being built, and the Army told their contractors that they now had a new assignment: get Southport back on its feet. Leila Piggott recalls it this way.
They put every boat back in that water. They cleaned up this town, and in a little over a week, you could hardly tell we had ever had a hurricane. They cleaned it up so fast. They would not take 1 cent for it, and they stayed day and night working just as hard as they could.
Meanwhile, people had to make a living. Hurricanes usually send the shrimp scurrying, either inshore or offshore. In 1954, it was toward Southport. There were plenty of shrimp, and Monday after the storm, boats could get out, but there was nowhere to take the catch. The shrimp houses were gone. But the floor of the new one that Dallas Piggott had started building was still intact, and thus was born the open-air shrimp house. Scales, boxes, and other equipment had been salvaged, but there was no power. But the city of Southport came to the rescue.
The city of Southport ran a special wire from a generator in back of the police department on Nash Street, which is way many blocks up, all the way down here to give us lights so we could pack shrimp. Because, of course, there was no electricity anywhere in Southport except generators. And the city had a large one, and they brought the lights that they put downtown to decorate for Christmas.
They finished that shrimp house eventually, and they put a roof on it. And today, it's the Shrimp House Restaurant. The last time anybody checked, those Christmas lights are still up in the attic. Some of the shrimp houses did rebuild eventually, but it was never the same, and the catches started to dwindle too. Captain John Potter, better known as Tookie, whose family runs the Shrimp House Restaurant, says that the shrimp just never were out there again like they had been.
Used to be a lot of shrimp. Everybody, you catch all you could do anything with. Now you can't catch enough to eat hardly, except 2 or 3 months out of the year. Used to catch just loads of shrimp, flounders. Now there's just not anything. Like I say, except from July through October, you can do pretty good, but other than that, it's not anything.
But while there were a lot of shrimp then, there wasn't much money in them.
The only time we'd go shrimping was when the tide was wrong for flounder fishing, because there was more money. You can make more money selling flounders than we could shrimp, because we was only getting 8 or 10 cents a pound for shrimp, and you're getting 25 cents a pound for flounder. So
Southport still has occasional hurricanes. In 1993, on Good Friday, there was this one, which with top winds of more than 100 miles an hour certainly qualified as one, but since it was outside the designated season, it didn't get a name. So people just call it the no-name hurricane. And in 1999, while Floyd was not Hazel, Oak Island was again reminded of the power of the surge which accompanies hurricanes. Cottages are far better built now than in 1954, but the surge still claimed many of them. Today, it's hard to tell that Southport's waterfront was once covered by piers, processing houses, fuel docks, and other structures now remembered as before Hazel. But there was a lot of business on the waterfront back then.
There were 9 different docks. Some people call them piers, but to me they were docks. 8 of them had shrimp house. There were shrimp house packing buildings, and then we had a quarantine dock, which was owned and operated by the Public Health Service, and they in turn were employed, or rather owned, the quarantine station where ships would go to be fumigated.
Fumigation was a little less sophisticated than the way they do it today.
They would put them to that quarantine station and take these great big number 10 wash tubs, put formaldehyde in it, put it in the hole and cover the hole up with canvas or whatever they had, and set them afire. And they'd burn for 24, maybe 36 hours to completely fumigate that ship.
Okay, let's fast forward for a moment and get our bearings. We're going to take a quick tour of the waterfront. First of all, there was not always a provision company restaurant, something some tourists find hard to believe. More than that, in the 1920s, there was no intercoastal waterway. At least not here, not yet.
There was no inland waterway between Morehead City and Georgetown, South Carolina, and transit boats would have to go to sea at Morehead, and there was a day's run. They would come into Southport and refuel or whatever, and get groceries and water, whatever they needed. And then they would go back to sea and go into Georgetown, South Carolina, which was another day's run. Then they could get back into the intercoastal.
The Ship's Chandler restaurant was once a real ship's chandlery, although a lot of tourists from somewhere inland don't have the foggiest notion of what a ship's chandler is. But before the restaurant, and before Mac's Cafe before that, a ship's chandler is what was here. Down toward Lord Street, there was a cannery. Then coming upriver, there were Dan Harrelson's grocery, a tavern, an Army surplus store, and a boat builder. Waterfront Park wasn't here before Hazel. After Hazel, some weren't sure the park was a good idea. Others disagreed.
Somebody said to me one time, says, "Aren't you upset that they're going to put a public park in front of your house?" I said, "No, I'm not at all disturbed about that, because what it used to be was a grocery store and a beer joint, and somebody was building a boat next to that, and then people would pull up their boats up there. Waterfront Park is a whole lot better than all of those."
Moving upriver just a little in front of the garrison, or Fort Johnston if you prefer, was a swimming area called Little Coney. It was a roped-off area with a beach that had a little more sand than is there now. There was a float, a diving board, and a wire fence around it to keep the sharks out. Up the hill, one wing of the garrison was the library. Kate Stewart, Jesse Taylor, and a lot of other people involved in the Women's Club and its predecessors had gotten the library started and found a 2-room home for it in a wing of the garrison closest to where the tennis courts are today. Susie Carson got a job there while still in high school.
I worked on Tuesday afternoon after school and all day Saturday, and I got $10 a month. The city paid me $5 and the Woman's Club paid me $5. And that was good money in the late 30s.
A lot of people in town donated books for the library and later for the bookmobile. No town worth its salt is without a ghost, and Southport has several of them. One of them just a little farther upriver in one of the largest houses. The Brunswick Inn was built on the site of what had been a home of Benjamin Smith, the man for whom Smithville had been named. Antonio Casaletta, affectionately known as Tony, was a harp player with a troupe of Italian musicians who had come to town and stayed at the inn. But on an outing one day to Battery Island, he drowned. Stuart Calary, who grew up in the Brunswick Inn, says the night of the tragedy, things got really interesting.
During the night, the guest heard his harp playing, and got up and came downstairs, and every string in it had broken. And that began the legend that Tony had returned to the inn. And I grew up there, and I can tell you, he's there. And the young couple that we sold it 3 years ago, and we told them that they would have someone living with them, and they smiled politely. But you talk to them now, and they believe they have been convinced.
When they visit the old Smithville burying ground on Rhett Street between Moore and Nash, tourists and newer residents find it hard to picture, but that area was once a lot busier.
There was a railroad station down at what was the end of the street, just before you get to the cemetery. The street would go there, and you'd turn around and come back. Rhett Street, the reason it's so much wider than the other streets is because that was where the railroad came in. And the railroad came in to what was called the coal dock.
The tracks were those of the WB&S, the Wilmington, Brunswick, and Southern officially. But to Southporters, the initials WB&S stood for either Will Bump and Shake or Willing but Slow. Tom Frink, who lived beside the railroad, said he remembers hopping aboard arriving coal trains for the final few blocks, hoping the conductor wasn't watching.
Well, just a little ride, because like I said, it was, when it slowed down for the trestle, it was almost to a creep. So we would hop on after the man would let us, and most time he'd run us off. We'd get a little ride before he'd run us off.
The railroad, which had come in 1911 and had run right down Rhett Street here, and the coal dock, were part of a dream some people had that eventually Southport would outstrip Wilmington as North Carolina's main port. In fact, some of them were so sure of that in 1887 they talked the legislature into changing the name of Smithville into Southport. Coal for ships was part of that plan, but oil supplanted coal as the fuel for ships about then, and it never came to be. Southport's railroad station burned in 1940 following an ammonia explosion that killed one man. But by then, both passenger and freight service had ended. One of Southport's most colorful characters was Kate Stewart, an early supporter of the railroad.
She fought for it for a long time, and it finally arrived in 1911. But somehow the city fathers overlooked her for the opening ceremonies. So she went out of town and got on a hand car in front of the train and pumped the hand car into town, escorting the train. And when it was in town, she just got off and went right up on the platform with the visiting dignitaries and took her place among them.
She even wrote a song about it. Kate ran a boarding house upriver a little from the Brunswick Inn, and it was there that she earned the title the heroine of Southport.
One day while Kate Stewart was tending to this child, the child fell off the end of the dock there into the Cape Fear River. And Kate dove in and saved her, and Captain Hunter had every ship in his fleet ever since then blow a salute to Kate Stewart as he went by.
We mentioned the quarantine station earlier. It was upriver a little ways, and the physician for the public health service in those early days was one of Southport's many heroes, Dr. Arthur Dozier. He would use the quarantine station for treating the whole community, not just the crews of arriving ships, as his grandson, Robert A. Bobby Jones, recalls.
For instance, he did 20 or 30 tonsil operations one Saturday morning. Set up appointments and let the word out all over the county for people to come in and have their tonsils taken out like a little clinic.
The quarantine station was a city all its own, built on pilings in the Cape Fear. And its doctor, Dr. Dozier, was Southport's own. He was the epitome of a country doctor. He not only made house calls, but if surgery was needed, often as not, he'd perform it right there on somebody's kitchen table. That concerned some people.
There was no place to operate. He operated on kitchen tables. He would travel all over the county, doing wonderful things. But I remember my father was very worried about it because he was a lawyer, and he said he wanted his friend Arthur Dozier to have a place to operate so he wouldn't get in trouble.
So C. Ed Taylor, Dr. Dozier, Ginsberg, who was a businessman as well as Dr. Dozier's ethicist, Dr. W.R. Goley, Dr. R.E. Broadway, and a bunch of other people started working on what became the county hospital. It opened in 1930, and in 1939, after Dr. Dozier's death, it was renamed for him. Eugene Gore, who had worked as a night orderly at the hospital, was there the night Dr. Dozier died. He remembers him as someone who thought a lot more about taking care of patients than he did about collecting a fee.
He liked people, and I know he never collected all this money, because whether you had money or not, you called Dr. Dozier, here he come.
There are many stories about him, but Arthur Dozier made national headlines in 1922 when he treated a young boy on whom the big city doctors had given up. The boy had a tumor which for 10 years had caused almost unbearable pain. The family found the boy unconscious while they were passing Southport on their boat. Dr. Dozier operated, and with what was admittedly less than up-to-date equipment, cured him. Eventually, the county commissioners decided they wanted the county hospital to be closer to the center of the county, so they built one there. But Southport, Long Beach, and the rest of Smithville Township fought to keep Dozier open. To say it was a long, hard struggle is putting it mildly. But today, Dozier Hospital is a source of comfort for those of us who live here, and a source of amazement for visitors who can't believe that a little town like this has a hospital like that. It doesn't matter who you are, a tourist, a newcomer, or a lifetime resident. There's something special about watching ships come in past Old Baldy on Bald Head Island, which, by the way, wasn't always called that, and going on upriver. But the existence of Old Baldy and the Cape Fear lighthouse that followed it, and the modern Oak Island light remind us that the legendary Frying Pan Shoals lie just offshore, and getting in here could be, and still can be, dangerous. It's not for nothing that mariners named our bit of geography Cape Fear. More than 30 years before the Revolutionary War, pilots from this area were watching for arriving ships. Some watched from a rise on Smith Island that was said to look like a bald head, and eventually the whole island was given that name. But whether in the 1700s by sail or in powerboats now, Southport's pilots have brought ships in safely. Piloting ships in has always been a demanding job. In the days of sail in the 1800s, after the days of the blockade runners, it was also highly competitive. This was Captain Toby Thompson's description.
43 pilots were working out of Bald Head at one time during the Civil War. And they would team up in 3s and 4s, maybe 5, and buy a boat, all of them sail vessels, they didn't know power. And they would go sometimes up as far as Hatteras to meet a ship that was bound to Wilmington, and the first man that got aboard that ship would bring it in.
But it was not only competitive, but dangerous, and more than once, it was deadly. In December of 1872, 5 pilots sailing out in rough seas to bring in 3 ships lying off the bar never came home. Despite an intensive search, only 1 body was ever recovered. 5 years later, long before that pain had eased, it happened again. This time it was the Mary K. Sprunt, which was caught with another pilot ship in another killer storm. When the weather cleared 3 days later, the Sprunt was gone with all hands. Not long afterward, the Cape Fear River pilots erected this monument to forever remember some of their own. Captain Toby Thompson, for 41 years one of those river pilots, is himself quite a story. He started bringing in ships at age 18, with only a chart and a magnetic compass to go by. One cold February night in stormy seas, his leg was crushed after he'd made the jump from the pilot boat to the ship's rope ladder, and the vessel slammed together. His doctor was not optimistic.
I was told by my doctor that I'd never walk on it again. I told him he didn't know who he was talking to. I said, I'll bet you $10 I'll be playing baseball by the 1st of July. He said, you don't know what you're talking about. I said, okay, we'll wait and see. And as it happened, he moved away, went to California. And I didn't get his $10, but I played baseball.
Not all the ships he piloted got in without mishap. Sometimes there were unexpected problems, as on a tanker one midnight.
And I told the wheelsman, the quartermaster, I said, "You were 15 degrees right rudder." And he did. And I noticed the ship was swinging real fast. And I said, "Put the wheel amidships." He put the wheel amidships, and she still kept swinging real hard right. I said, "Put a hard left." He said, "Captain, I've had a hard left for a right good while, and I'm not getting any response." Well, I told the mate to go forward and let go the anchor, and I rung the ship full astern, and we wound up on Battery Island over there.
It turned out that a key had snapped and fallen out of the shaft on the steering engine. They fixed it, then backed out and tried it again. While it was the river pilots who got ships safely past Bald Head into Southport, it was the lighthouses which alerted ships to where the dangers were. And, at least in the early days, every lighthouse meant a lighthouse keeper. Bald Head had the legendary Captain Charlie Swan. He had come there when Cape Fear Lighthouse replaced Old Baldy in 1903. His daughter, Margaret Hood, remembers it as a great place to grow up, even when, at age 15, she decided to swim to Southport against Captain Charlie's advice.
So my daddy says, Margaret, he didn't want me to do it. Yeah. He said there was a lot of sharks at that time of the year in the Cape Fear River. But I took off one day, and I told them that, of course, they were watchmen, and my oldest brother followed me in a boat in case I got cramps. And just before I got to the dock in Southport, then my legs were already, they had those bad cramps. But I knew enough how to handle myself, and I got
you made the
ladder, so I got to the ladder.
While Bald Head is a great place for bird watching today, there was a time before World War II when you could watch pigs running loose. Something over 200 black and white ones that a developer had brought there. Kind of hard to imagine today. But no harder to imagine than the story Miss Margaret told the late Stateport pilot editor James Harper about selling sea turtle eggs to get money to go shopping.
Many a dress I bought with the turtle egg money.
Really?
I'd get the eggs and my brother sell them, see, they bring them over. So,
What was the going price for turtle eggs? About a penny a piece?
15 cents, yeah, 15 cents a dozen.
A good many years later, the eggs still were there for the taking, and the price hadn't changed.
We used to go with Bald Head and dig them up and bring them to Southport and sell them for 15 cents a dozen.
It's hard for newcomers to picture getting to and from Oak Island before the bridge opened in 1975. There was a floating swing bridge before that, but a barge hit it in 1971 and put it out of commission. And even earlier, there had been a hand-powered ferry.
And he could carry like 2 or 3 automobiles, and he had a cable run all the way across, and he had a stick on that cable. He had a notch in it. He could take and pull that barge across from one side to the other.
So what was it like growing up and living in Southport? Well, there was less traffic for one thing, a lot less. You could take a nap in the middle of the street, or at least one resident did.
I remember Pot Liquor, and he would lie down there under that stoplight at in the middle of the Howard Moore Street, and the cars would just go around and you didn't bother the dog.
While Pot Liquor couldn't exactly be called a watchdog, kids in those days knew that that didn't mean that no one was watching.
Everyone literally knew your business, so Mother never had to worry about us. Whatever we did was reported back long before we got home. So we had the freedom to explore and play hide and go seek and Red Rover, and all the wonderful games all over town.
For a long time, most of the streets of the town weren't paved. That was back before television, of course, and people were outside their houses a lot more. Long before that 1950 song, Standing on the Corner, there was a favorite corner for standing around and catching up on what was happening in Southport. It was the northeast corner of Howe and Moore. Now, the Bullfrog Corner stuffed animal shop is there. But back then, it was called Monkey Wrench Corner, and nobody seems real sure why.
My daddy would come home from work in the evenings and get a bath, get cleaned up. He had a sawmill. And after supper, he'd go down and stand around with the men at Monkey Wrench Corner. Evidently, they had a gossip group going on down there, but there at the corner of Howe and Moore was a gathering place for the men. And, of course, I'm sure the restaurant had its appeal, too.
There were other places to spend time. On that corner was Jimmy the Greek's restaurant. No relation to the Las Vegas odds maker. Moore Street had a couple of drugstores, too, across from each other. Leggett's and Dr. Watson's. That last one was run by Dr. D.I. Watson, who actually was an M.D., but had decided to run the drugstore instead. For you visitors, if you ate at the pharmacy restaurant on your visit, that's why it's called that. It was a pharmacy. After Dr. Watson's death, the Calari family bought the pharmacy, running it and later 2 retail establishments nearby. One of them, where Davis Dry Goods is now, was called Arrington's.
That was an all-purpose store that sold cloth and boots and shoes and blue jeans, just a little bit thread, a little bit of everything. That was an all-purpose store. And then we bought a little store right next to that, and Mother wanted a nice little dress shop. So it was an exclusive little dress shop with women's and very small children, really baby clothes.
Earlier, one of the hangouts for men of Southport was the Whittler's Bench at the foot of Howell Street. The story is that Pack Tharp, who ran a barbershop up Howell Street a ways, could see the men of the town standing in the hot sun down toward the river, arguing about politics. That was back when McKinley was running against William Jennings Bryan. Mr. Tharp decided they needed a bench to sit on and some shade. At various times since the 1890s, the bench has and hasn't had a shade tree or two in the middle of it. Since Bertha hit in '96, it hasn't. Speaking of trees, if you hear someone refer to what's now called Franklin Square Park as the Grove, you automatically know they've lived here a while. You should know also that it was called the Grove for most of its history. It's part of that area that the founders had the foresight to set aside for public purposes when they founded the town. As for its being a park, that didn't happen until the WPA made it into one during the Depression. Before that, Dry Street went right through the middle of it, and all those azaleas weren't there either. But mothers went there to the Grove pump to get pictures of the coldest, and government tests confirm, some of the purest water anywhere. Kids loved it there too.
We could pump all the water we wanted and slop in it and watch the horses come by and drink out of the trough and all that kind of thing. Man, that was the place to be. Some of the boys played baseball there, but most of us girls built playhouses. We'd take our mother's yard rakes and rake the leaves so we could make rooms, and then we used that for our playhouse.
Also in the Grove is what's now the Franklin Square Art Gallery. Like nearly everything else in Southport, it used to be something else. It was built as a school right after the turn of the century. Then it sprouted wings as the school grew. And later, those wings were removed and moved intact to be used at the Brunswick County Training School. But through the years, the building had many uses, including being the home of the Southport Public Library for a while.
What we call Franklin Square Art Gallery now became the City Hall. And upstairs, I think the American Legion met in there, and one time there was a dance hall there, and I forgot exactly when it started being a sort of a community building.
It even served as a place of worship for area Catholics. Among Southport's landmarks were the Swamp Gardens. They started around the turn of the century and lasted past the Victory Garden era of World War II. There was a big one at Jabbertown and another one here along the west side of Bonnets Creek, growing cabbages, collards, corn, and the like.
They just go down and clean off a space and start planting. And they'd do it for years and years. They'd come back to the same spot. If somebody had got that spot, they'd find another spot and just dig it up. And there was a guy down there by the name of Luke Jones. He had to build a shed And he lived down there. And he would get his vegetables and sell it right at the shed. People come to the shed and buy it.
Communication was a lot simpler back then. Sometimes it was faster. In many cases, you could just yell across the back fence. Or, if you weren't close enough for that, Miss Edna Dozier was always there.
I'd call and I said, Miss Edna, give me the office, because you asked her to connect you. Okay. I said, Miss Edna, I want to speak to Jim at the office. She said, well, he just went in the drugstore, so there's no use calling there. And she look out the window and tell you where people were and where you could get up with them right away.
Tom Frank says that there were times when the only meat some Southport people had to eat was marsh hens. They fed a lot of people, he says, but there was a trick in trying to find them.
What they would do, they would catch them like new moon and full moon. You know, you got a extra high tide. And they use a boat and a pole and a pole along, and the marsh hen make the nest in the marsh. So when they go along with full tide, they could see them. Low tide, you wouldn't see him. He wouldn't come out. And I think some of the guys used to hunt by themselves. A lot of them would have two guys. One guy would pole the boat, and the other guy would do the shooting.
One of the defining traditions of Southport actually started before there was a town. In 1775, in the patriotic fervor which preceded the Declaration of Independence, Josiah Martin, the British royal governor, with the locals breathing down his neck, had to flee to a nearby warship and hightail it. Since shortly after that, Independence Day celebrations have become a long, loud, and unbroken tradition. Now folks from the whole area and much of the state fill the town to overflowing every year. It's the state's official 4th of July observance. It's something you have to see to believe. It's fun, crowded, boisterous, hometowny, musical, and virtually without exception, it's hot. Did you just move here? Think you've left snow behind forever? Not exactly. It doesn't happen often. This big one was in 1989, well over a foot. And in 2000, we woke to half an inch, but it had melted by about 10:30 that morning. But back to the good old days. Basketball has always been a favorite pastime in Southport, as it is pretty much throughout North Carolina, but it was especially true here after an outdoor court was built.
First time basketball was played here in Southport was on a court outdoors, but it had a floor with benches around it, and people would sit and watch the games sitting on the benches around this court. In fact, I have pictures of that, of people playing with the black bloomers, the women played with, but that was outdoors.
Even before the games had moved indoors, winning at basketball had become a habit at Southport High School.
We had wonderful basketball teams. We were tops in the county. And the girls' teams were equally as important as the boys' teams. You always had a girls' game and a boys' game on the same evening. We had a glee club. A lot of our social life, well, actually, our social life did revolve around school events or church events. That was about it.
Much of the social life of Southport revolved around the churches, but even that could get tricky.
I was Methodist. I had one Catholic friend. Well, I thought that was wonderful because they only had church about once a month, since they had to have a visiting priest come down. The next best were the Episcopalians, because they had very short services. And I loved the Baptist church because they had a basketball team. And their preacher would take all of their kids to the beach. If they came to Sunday school and church that morning, that afternoon, he would ride them to the beach. And I begged my mother to let me become a Baptist or Catholic or an Episcopalian, but she made me stay a Methodist.
In the 1990s, hurricanes took a liking, it seems, to the steeple of Southport Baptist Church. One storm bent the cross a little, the next one bent it a little more, and finally, Dennis got the whole thing. In an act of faith in 2001, the Baptist erected a new one and supposedly a stronger one. We'll see. Over the years, basketball and even a bowling alley were part of the Masonic building. In fact, through the years, it's had a number of uses too. And 2 wings were added at one point, but eventually those were removed. Mostly, those changes involved wartime, both World War I and World War II. And this is as good a time as any to talk about that. Both World Wars saw servicemen stationed here to man guns at Fort Caswell, as they had in previous wars. It was to provide a place for the men in uniform during the First World War that one of those wings was added to the Masonic building to accommodate what was called the Army-Navy Club. Also used by the soldiers and sailors during World War I was the pavilion at the foot of Pott Street, that's called Atlantic now, where there was dancing and entertainment. Toby Thompson used to tell a story of some out-of-sight activity that went on in that building.
The lowest story was a mine cellar. And I remember my uncle and some of his cronies went there one time, took a ship auger, drilled a hole up through the floor and into the wine barrel and got all the wine in one and let the rest go out on the ground.
As it did everywhere, World War II involved everyone in Southport in one way or another. While the radio was telling us that Lucky Strike Green had gone to war, Southport shrimp boats had too, as anti-submarine patrol boats. Those of us with enough gray hair remember gasoline and meat rationing, and saving tin cans, war bonds, blackouts, all those things. But in Southport, as elsewhere along the East Coast, while places like Wilmington were building ships, U-boats were lying offshore to sink them. Too often, they succeeded. Too many times there were scenes like this one, and survivors of torpedoed ships were treated here. Leela Piggott has these memories.
They had to swim through fire to get out of it. Luckily, we saved a lot of them, and I will tell you that when they died, we cried like babies. It was compassion. We waited, and then maybe a few days later we'd hear another explosion, and here we went again. That went on through the entire war.
Stuart Kalari remembers the scene that followed the U-boat attacks.
The bodies of the wounded and the dead right in at the foot of the street there where the ship's Chandler restaurant is, because they didn't have, we had one hearse in town, I'm sure that was the only one we had, and I suppose we had an ambulance, I don't remember that, but I know that they made a call for everyone who had the old woodies, the station wagons, to please volunteer to come down to the waterfront to transport these people in bodies, and it was a very sad time.
Today on the Southport waterfront stands a permanent reminder of those days and of those aboard the tanker John D. Gill, sunk by German submarine U-158. Some of the many who were injured or lost off our coast. U-158 herself lasted only a little while longer. Her days of listening to cheers as she returned to Bremerhaven were numbered. It wasn't long before she was sunk with all hands off Bermuda. Much of Southport's labor force went to Wilmington shipyards to build Liberty ships during World War II. Eugene Gore was among them, but he wasn't comfortable working on the Sabbath. His first boss said that was okay, but then a new one came in, and he said Gore didn't have a choice.
So he talked to him and told me to go home and sit down and think about it, because the ox was in the ditch. We were in the war, explained that to me. And so I thought a few minutes, and then after I made my mind up, sure enough, I told him that I wouldn't want to have him sitting up there waiting on me Sunday. I said, because I was going to be in Sunday school.
The good Lord may have been proud of him, but the shipyard gave him his pink slip. But within days, Frank Plaxco at Brunswick Navigation had given him a job. Those were the days when Southport had only one traffic light, which was one more than the rest of the county did. But it did have a movie theater. Mr. Price Furpless had seen to that. It was called the Amuse You. And even today, you can spot a newcomer immediately when they read the sign and say Amazoo. Going there to be amused did cost money, but not much.
I remember one time, I think it cost a dime to get in, and one time when they wanted to clean up the places around town where water could collect and where mosquitoes could lay eggs, he offered all the children in town a certain number of tickets for a certain number of cans that they could bring, empty cans that they'd pick up around town. And we cleaned up the town one time that way.
But picking up bottles wasn't the only way.
When we were kids and we wanted to go to a movie, we'd go to one of these shrimp houses and head shrimp, and you got a nickel a 10-quart water bucket full. And we'd get 3 buckets, and we had 15 cents. We could go to movies and buy a bag of peanuts.
As the years and the movie stars moved on from Shirley Temple and Tom Mix to Doris Day and Rock Hudson, Elvis Presley and James Dean, movie-going teenagers from Southport High School suddenly had no school to go to. Mostly ashes remained.
I went and got my sister and brother and took them down to watch it burn, and I went in and tried to get, did get some of the stuff out of the office and some of the records, and along with everybody else in town was trying to get what they could out of it, and got the trophy cases and stuff. It was kind of a sad night.
The immediate problem was where classes could be held. There was no one place that could handle everyone.
Yes, classes were held over in our Sunday school rooms and other places in town also out at Brunswick County Training School. The classes were scattered all over everywhere.
They didn't rebuild the school on that site, but something remains. A bell rung for many years by Charlie Lee, a favorite of the students.
We had a Charlie Lee, who was our janitor, rang the school bell every morning, and if we got there early enough, he would often let one of us help him ring the school bell, which, by the way, is the only thing that was saved during the fire. It's out in front of the post office.
Brunswick Training School students had a role model in their longtime principal, A.C. Cavanis, for whom one of the city's parks is now named.
I really believe even today that he was the most educated black man in the county. And a lot of people looked up to him. And many times I've heard that white people wanted to send their children to Cavanis, but at that time, they couldn't do it. And he really was a role model.
Like so many in Southport, a number of the graduates of Brunswick Training School who spent their lives working on the water had followed Mr. Cavanis's advice about the value of education, and they started taking classes. Tom Frink, once a mess boy on a pogie boat, studied his way to assistant engineer on a tug at Sunny Point. Eugene Gore says that faced with the usual choice of teaching, preaching, or going fishing, he saw another choice too.
Now what I did, I went over here they was giving navigation classes way where the post office is, not a high school. And one of the Doziers, we call him Doc Dozier. I went to classes under him so I could learn something about the water and the ocean. And it paid off.
Although there were some unpleasant hassles, he retired as a ferryboat captain on the Southport Fort Fisher run. One of Southport's attractions for tourists hasn't been one for all that long. The Indian Trail tree in Keziah Park, according to many people who grew up here, was just an odd-shaped tree until an unlikely source gave it fame. A tale you can believe or not.
The story that I have been told was that the Indians would, when they came down, they would mark their way back by bending down a sapling and sticking it, breaking it off and sticking it in the ground. And it would show them how to get back to where they were away from the coast. And I remember that Robert Ripley in his Believe It or Not column said there were only 5 in the United States left. And one of them was this one here in Southport. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it's been called the Indian Trail Tree ever since.
Town historian Susie Carson isn't so sure either.
As far as I know, it could very well have been a part of a trail tree, but it was, I mean, a part of an Indian trail. But it's so near the water that it seemed to me like by that time they'd know they were at the water.
The little park is named after W.B. Keziah, a newspaper man who could neither hear nor speak. But that didn't stop him. He'd write down questions, and if he couldn't read your lips enough to understand the answer, he would have you write it down. Keziah believed in Southport.
The trail tree lot there is called it's the trail tree, but it's called Keziah Park. And it's in memory of Keziah, who boosted Southport every chance he could get. He'd write letters. He'd spend all of his salary on postage and write letters all over the United States boosting Southport.
But if he loved Southport, Margaret Harper says that while she was running the paper while her husband was in the service, she found out one thing Keziah didn't like.
He didn't like working for a woman, though, I'll tell you that. He didn't like that a bit.
Besides the Indian Trail tree, there's another Southport legend. You'll hear about it these days when the town's full of tourists, and some old-timers will say they wish we still had it. It was the town gate.
People just let their livestock run wild, and they had to keep some of it out of town. So, and I remember reading some old minutes of the town. I can't remember, about 1895 or something like that. There was an ordinance passed that there was in those days it would be a terrific fine if you left the gate open.
If that comment about wishing the town gate were still here sounded a little bit harsh, maybe you ought to consider the history. Because here in Southport, instead of a century or decades, it's only been a handful of years since the best of the good old days. And if you think Southport's houses look like they were out of a Norman Rockwell painting, well, keep in mind that just a handful of days before yesterday, her people were too.
Looked after each other, and because everybody was involved in fishing or shrimping, and in the summertime, just about everybody had good money, you know. In the wintertime, didn't nobody have any money. And if anybody needed something, you know, they managed to get it somehow or another. And the people are by far I think the biggest change. Now you don't hardly know your neighbor, where when I was growing up, you knew everybody.